It's good to have you guys back after what I'd like to think was an awesome lunch break. So our first speaker, right, is Dr. Ndivhuwo Makondo. He's a research scientist in machine learning at IBM Research Africa in the South Africa lab, and a visiting lecturer at the School of Computer Science and Applied Mathematics at the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. Right. He holds a BSc and an MSc in electrical engineering from the University of Cape Town, South Africa, and a PhD in computational intelligence and system science from the Tokyo Institute of Technology in Japan. So he began his career on a master's studentship at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, that's the CSIR, in 2011, and has been with the Mobile Intelligent Autonomous Systems Group, where he conducted research on stability analysis and path planning for mobile manipulators as part of the mining safety platform project. He then enrolled for a PhD at the Tokyo Institute of Technology in 2013, conducting research in machine learning and robotics, where he investigated the acceleration of robot learning of motor skills with knowledge transfer. Prior to joining IBM in 2019, he was a research lead of the mobile manipulation project at the CSIR MEAS lab for a year, where he led a team which was investigating the deployment of robot manipulators in unstructured and dynamic environments. Can we give him a round of applause as he comes to the stage?
All right, good afternoon, and I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to give a talk on my work. All right, so as mentioned, I recently joined IBM as a research scientist in artificial intelligence, but I'll talk about the work I did prior to joining IBM. All right. So the title of my talk is Machine Learning for Robot Control. So I'll just give a brief overview of how machine learning has been applied for low-level robot control based on my experience, so it's not necessarily exhaustive. Right. So the agenda is as follows. I'll give a brief intro to robot control, give motivation of why you would use machine learning for robot control, and I'll give a brief discussion on the learning control algorithms applied, and then highlight some challenges you face when learning for physical robots, and finally some future directions on proposals and dealing with these issues. So just briefly, in robot control, the objective is to generate some motor commands in order to control the robot to perform some task, right? And the tasks are typically defined in the task space or the workspace, which basically consists of the 3D position and orientation of the robot's end effector. It's basically the space in which it can reach. And control typically happens in the configuration space. So this is the set of joints, motor joints for the robot. And so we typically need mappings that transform tasks in the task space, which is intuitive for humans to define this task for the robot, into the joint space where you can derive your control policies to perform the tasks. And you typically have kinematics, where you transform task space trajectories into the joint space, the trajectory of your joint angles to perform the task. You also have dynamics, where you map from these joint space trajectories to the velocities or the torque commands for your robot to perform the task. For example, in the left of that picture, you would have your task space where the goal is to go from some initial position to the final position, which in the joint space would typically correspond to some joint angle trajectory. So I'll just give an example of using inverse dynamics control, where the input is your joint space trajectories in terms of position, velocity, and acceleration, and the model predicts the torque commands for the robot to perform the tasks. And what you get out is the actual trajectory that the robot followed, which may be different from your desired trajectory because your model may not be accurate. And you typically have a feedback controller that compensates for the errors and also stabilizes your system. So analytical approaches use human insight to derive mathematical models For example, this called rigid body dynamics, which based on the properties of the robot, you can use it to calculate or predict the torque you must apply to the robot. So classical approaches, like I said, rely on human insights into physics and based on the parameters of the robot. And these have shown to work well in some limited situations. Typically, you're in a stationary and structured environment where everything is known, and where humans must stay away because everything must be designed around the robot. You don't want to make your environment unstructured. So why use machine learning? So firstly, humans are prone to errors, so you could have modeling errors in your models. And there are also some factors that are difficult to analytically model, such as friction, hydraulic tubes. And these models are usually static, so if the environment changes or your robot changes due to wear and tear over time, you have to recalibrate your model. And they're also not applicable to soft compliant robots, also called collaborative robots, which are the robot systems that you find these days that enable collaboration with human partners. And the benefits of learning-based control, the hypothesis is that if the data generated by the robot encodes all the structure of the robot, you're able to learn more accurate models. And also, you're able to factor in all the nonlinear factors. And this can also adapt to changes in the environment or the robot itself. And also allows autonomous operation of robot in a sense that instead of classical approaches where you have to study the robot can learn online and adapt to the changes. So based on this, a lot of researchers kind of just ditched the old analytical approaches and said, let's focus on building pure learning algorithms that can learn from data. So using the same example, when you learn, so you replace your pre-computed model with a learning model represented by the dashed arrow. And this model learns to predict based on feedback it receives on the robot. And you have a learning signal, which is basically the actual trajectory of the robot and the torque that was applied to the robot. And initially, you start with an uninitialized model or random initialized model, so your model will do very bad, but it will rely on the feedback controller to drive it to explore around your task, and eventually it will learn to generalize over the task. And this is usually usually use standard regression models to learn these mappings. But there are some criteria that you have to meet in order to apply these techniques for robot control. The first one is online incremental learning. Because these systems are usually high dimensional and also have large state spaces, it's almost impossible to explore that space entirely. So you want models that learn to do well in some local domain and improve over time. Also, since you're learning and making predictions in a real-time control loop, you want to be able to update your models fast and also make fast predictions. So as a result, a lot of research in robot control was spent on how to extend standard regression models to fit this criteria. There have been two main ideas. So the first one is based on locally weighted learning, which is the idea of approximating complex nonlinear functions with multiple locally linear models, which are fast to update and also fast predictions. And these are some of the examples that have been proposed. The other idea is based on data specification. So instead of using all the data that you get from your robot, you'll find a small representative or prototypes of your data and use that to learn. And this is typically applied on kernel-based machine learning, such as Gaussian processes and support vector regression. We have to invert a large matrix to learn. However, a lot of researchers realized that learning on physical robots is actually difficult. So because the first reason is large state action spaces and high dimensionality, which means that your robot has to perform a lot of random exploration in order to collect enough data to learn accurate models if it's learning from scratch. And this also can risk damaging the robot before it can actually start learning something useful. So then researchers started saying, okay, what can you do to make learning for robots safe and also much faster than it is now? So next, I'll just go through briefly some ideas that have been proposed that people are working on. The common idea between them is this idea of using prior knowledge. And this knowledge can come from different sources. The first one is transfer learning, which is the idea that as humans, we don't always learn from scratch. So we rely on knowledge created by our peers, our teachers, our parents. So it doesn't really make sense for that each robot must learn from scratch. And integrating domain knowledge. So this is where people started looking back at these analytical models that have been derived previously and say, there must be some knowledge that that's really useful. So let's reuse that and only learn the parts of the system that we don't understand. Also, the idea of sim to real transfer. So it's the idea of that you learn your models in simulation, and then you learn to adapt them to the real world. And lastly, it's meta learning, where you learn variations of tasks to optimize for future tasks. So my work was basically using transfer learning. So I'll just show a few slides on how I use transfer learning for that. So here the idea is that you have, say, a very cheap robot that you don't mind damaging. So you do a lot of learning experiments on it. And then you also have a new robot that may be more expensive. Instead of the new robot exploring from scratch, why not reuse some data generated by the first robot to accelerate learning on the second robot? And here the task was to use inverse dynamics control to track some straight line trajectories originating from the same point. Here I'll just show some videos, the results in simulation. So this is basically learning from scratch without knowledge transfer. So you can see that in the first few trials of learning, it's basically doing random trajectories around the tasks. But you can see that with knowledge transfer, it already starts performing the task more or less well, but much better than learning from scratch with knowledge transfer. Okay, so secondly, so the idea of integrating domain knowledge. So the idea is that let's use our intuition of physics to structure our machine learning models such that they can generalize better, learn from less data, and hopefully we achieve more accurate models. And one of the examples from this paper cited here is to use the parametric rigid body dynamics model and combine it with non-parametric machine learning to achieve a semi-parametric machine learning that is much better than just one of these in isolation. And one example is, so it's basically you have on the right the first equation where your top predictions come from the parametric part, which in a Gaussian process could be, instead of having a Gaussian process centered at zero mean, it could be centered at this parametric model, and you learn the other part that you don't understand. Then the other approaches so based on kernel machine learning, where you can derive new kernels based on this RBD model and combine it with your standard kernels, such as the squared exponential. Then you also have simulation to real transfer. There's actually a Twitter handle dedicated to this approach, which is a collection of all the papers in simulation to real transfer. So this is similar to the previous idea of integrating domain knowledge, whereas here the knowledge is encoded in this simulated version of your robot. So the good thing is that you have abundant data to learn. You can also learn it in faster than real time, where if you accelerate your simulation. So what will take you weeks, months to collect, to run experiments, probably take you a few hours. But the problem is the simulation may not represent the real world very well. So you use some transfer learning algorithms or even domain adaptation to adapt your simulated model to the real world. And then lastly, with meta-learning, so here the idea is that you want to learn new skills or adapt to new environments rapidly with few training examples. And here, so given multiple tasks that are learned in sequence, instead of just learning each task individually, you want to learn some parameter of some meta-learner that extracts some useful information about the learning process of these tasks. And this task must be similar in some sense. And then you use that to optimize learning for a new related task that you see in the future. In this particular example, where you would have task models updated using gradient descent at the top, you would have the H function that transforms the gradients of the loss of the task in order to update the parameters, where H is typically the learning rate. But here, in the second equation, you want to learn that function. So you want to update the parameters from the previous task so that you do well on the new task. So you transfer knowledge from previous tasks onto future tasks. So in conclusion, so I provided some motivation why you would use machine learning for robot control, and also highlight where this would fail, and also discuss a few directions where research is shaping to in order to address these challenges. So, thank you.
I just want to ask, with regarding maybe using transfer learning for robotic control, is there a way actually you can verify that, let's say you have a new learning task and you're not sure of that, what you're trying to actually transfer from what already exists to the new task, like how correlated it is. Like, on whether what, already exists, like how related is it from, like your new task that you're trying to learn? How can you prove that maybe it's doing something from the learning transferred from existing model, but it's not actually what we wanted to get from previous learning process in a way?
Yeah, okay, so there are two types of transfer. So one is where you're transferring from a similar robot, or you performing the same task. So there the idea is you would generate some data of correspondences between the robots, and then you learn a mapping. So you can use traditional machine learning frameworks for validating whether the mapping is accurate or not, using some validation data. So that's one way you can check. And for transfer within the same robot for multiple tasks, it's usually started in reinforcement learning. So there are approaches of looking at task similarities. So before you do transfer, you first check if the two tasks are similar. I'm not sure if there are general approaches, but it will depend on the type of task that you're transferring.
Sorry, my question's more of a general one, just interested in the video you're showing. What exactly was the task that was being transferred there?
So it's the task of tracing the star trajectory. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so I also have a question. Could you elaborate more on how you would go about transferring between morphologically different systems? Like, for example, if you have the one robot arm has two links, and then the other one, or basically one robot arm that has two joints, and then you're going either to one that has 7 joints, or a more general example is something like I'm a human being and I'm interested in transferring the trajectory that my arm is undergoing to a target platform.
Okay, so one approach that I used here was, so the two robots that I showed actually have different link dimensions, also the dimensionality, number of degrees of freedom. There are cases where that will break down. For example, if you're transferring from a 5 degrees of freedom system that has the capacity to perform the task to a robot maybe with 2 links that is not able to perform the task, that may be difficult. But generally, what you would do is you would generate sort of correspondence points. So you let each robot randomly explore similar tasks. And from that, you can learn the common latent space shared among the two, and then use that as a bridge. So it's a combination of dimensionality reduction to match the two, the dimension of the two spaces. You also learn a mapping function from one source space to the task space.
Can we give him one last round of applause?